I never thought much about working in a morgue. It wasn't some dream job or calling. It was just where I ended up. The hours were good, the pay was steady, and I'd always considered myself pretty unshakable. The dead are dead, right? No surprises there. At least that's what I told myself. The morgue was housed in the basement of a crumbling old hospital. The air always felt damp, and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was constant. One of those low, droning noises that you stop noticing until everything else goes silent. My station was wedged between rows of refrigerated lockers on one side and a pair of stainless steel autopsy tables on the other. It was stark, cold, and sterile. Exactly what you'd expect, I guess. But there was something about the place that always felt off. Maybe it was the way sound seemed to die the moment you stepped through the door, or how the shadows seemed darker than they should be, like they soaked up the light instead of reflecting it. The first time I noticed something strange, I chalked it up to exhaustion. It was around 2 a.m., and I was alone, cataloging belongings from a John Doe who'd been brought in earlier that day. A car accident, they said. Nothing unusual about him, aside from the fact that his body was a mess of broken bones and bruised skin. I wasn't looking at him, though. My focus was on the paperwork when, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw his hand twitch. I froze, pen hovering just above the clipboard. My heart hammered in my chest as I slowly turned to look. His arm was exactly where it had been before, dangling limply off the side of the gurney, fingers curled inward like he was clutching something invisible. I stared for what felt like minutes, but nothing moved. Finally, I let out a shaky laugh, muttering something about nerves, and went back to work. That should have been the end of it. Just a trick of the light, a misfire in my overtired brain. But once you notice something like that, it's hard to let it go. Every time I looked up, I found myself watching the bodies, not deliberately at first. Just a quick glance to make sure everything was where it should be. But soon I was doing it all the time. I'd stop in the middle of a task to scan the room, half expecting to catch one of them shifting ever so slightly, maybe an arm falling to a different position or a head tilting just a fraction of an inch. Most of the time, everything was still, until it wasn't. One night, about a week after the hand twitch incident, I was alone again. The morgue seemed quieter than usual, like even the fluorescent lights had decided to hum softer. I was finishing up cleaning one of the autopsy tables when I heard it. A soft, scraping sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but in the silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. My head whipped around so fast it made my neck crack, and my eyes landed on a body bag lying on one of the gurneys in the corner. The zipper had moved. I stood there, staring at that body bag, my grip on the cleaning cloth tightening until my knuckles went white. The zipper hadn't opened completely, but it had shifted. A few inches down from where it had been, just enough to make the edges gape slightly. The air felt heavier all of a sudden, pressing down on me, and a chill prickled along the back of my neck. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd misremembered the zipper's position. Maybe I hadn't pulled it all the way up earlier. Maybe, but even as I thought it, my gut twisted, because I knew I always zipped the bags closed. Every time. It was part of the routine, part of keeping things neat and respectful. I checked that bag myself not an hour earlier. The rational part of my brain told me to ignore it, to just walk away and pretend I hadn't noticed anything. But something else, curiosity, fear, or maybe both, kept my feet rooted to the floor. The scrape of the zipper echoed in my mind, and my chest felt tight as I took a hesitant step closer. The room seemed colder now, the fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh, unnatural shadows. I reached the gurney, my breath fogging faintly in the chilled air. The body inside was an older man, Mr. Halverson. Heart attack. I'd wheeled him in earlier that evening, zipped him up myself. I leaned in, peering at the gap in the zipper. The light reflected off the black vinyl, and I could see just a sliver of the body inside. The pale, grayish skin of his chest was still and lifeless. Of course it was. I almost laughed at myself for being so jumpy. But then I saw it. The chest moved. It wasn't dramatic, not some wild, heaving breath, just the faintest rise and fall, like someone trying to breathe without making a sound. My stomach dropped, and every hair on my body stood on end. I stumbled back, my mind racing. It wasn't possible. He'd been dead for hours, confirmed by the attending physician. There were no machines hooked up to him, no ventilators or monitors, nothing. And yet I swore I'd seen it. "Calm down," I muttered to myself, my voice trembling. "It's just your eyes playing tricks. Bodies can twitch sometimes, right? Nerves firing. That's all it is." But that didn't explain the zipper. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the zipper pull with shaking fingers. The metal was cold against my skin, and for a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me not to do it, to walk away and call someone else. But who was I going to call? "Hi, I think one of the corpses might be alive," wasn't exactly a sentence that would go over well with my supervisor. I yanked the zipper down. The first thing I noticed was the smell. A faint but unmistakable whiff of decay. It was normal, expected even, but somehow it seemed sharper than usual, almost sour. I pulled the bag open wider, exposing the upper half of Mr. Halverson's body. His face was ashen, his lips slightly parted. His eyes were closed, sunken into his skull. Dead. He was dead. There was no doubt about it. And yet, the longer I looked, the more I felt like I was being watched. Like his closed eyelids weren't enough to stop him from seeing me. I leaned in closer, looking for some sign, anything, to explain what I'd seen. That's when his head moved. It wasn't much, just a slight tilt to the side, but it was enough to send me stumbling back, a strangled yelp escaping my throat. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. For a moment, I stood there, staring, expecting him to move again, but he didn't. His head was still, tilted at that slight angle, his face frozen in the same lifeless expression. A cold, creeping dread began to claw its way up my spine. This wasn't normal. This wasn't some postmortem spasm or a trick of the light. Something was wrong. That's when the lights flickered. The morgue plunged into darkness for half a second before the fluorescence buzzed back to life, casting everything in harsh, flickering light. My heart was hammering in my chest, the sound of blood rushing in my ears. I glanced at the body bag again, and my stomach churned. The zipper was fully open now, the bag's edges falling away from the body inside. And his eyes were open. I froze. Those eyes, they weren't the cloudy, unfocused kind you'd expect from a corpse. They were sharp, bright even. The irises a pale, watery blue that seemed to gleam under the flickering fluorescent lights. They locked onto mine with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. My mind scrambled for answers, anything to explain what I was seeing, but every logical thought collapsed under the weight of pure, primal terror. Then he blinked. It was slow, deliberate, a movement so ordinary yet so impossibly wrong. The sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven, filled the room as I staggered back. My hand fumbled along the counter until it found a metal tray, which I gripped like a lifeline. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. "Mr. Halverson?" I whispered, though I had no idea why I said his name. My voice sounded foreign, small, like it belonged to someone else. His lips twitched, pulling upward into the barest hint of a smile. Not a warm, friendly smile. This one was thin and strained, like he was unused to the movement. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just watched me, that unsettling grin plastered across his pale face. I wanted to run, to bolt out of that room and never come back. But my legs refused to move, locked in place by the weight of my own disbelief. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. He was dead. I'd seen the paperwork, the autopsy report. I'd zipped him into that bag myself. As if to mock my thoughts, he moved again. His head tilted further to the side, almost curiously, like he was studying me. One of his hands twitched, the fingers curling slightly before going still. The sound of his fingernails scraping lightly against the stainless steel table sent a shiver through me. I need to call someone," I stammered, my voice cracking. I reached for the radio clipped to my belt, but my fingers were trembling so badly that I fumbled it. the device clattering loudly to the floor. The sound echoed through the room, breaking the silence. And that's when I realized something else. It wasn't just Mr. Halverson. The room had grown unbearably still, the kind of silence that feels alive, like it's pressing in on you from every direction. My gaze darted to the other gurneys, the rows of bodies lined up in their sterile black bags. For the first time, I noticed how the shadows beneath the tables seemed to stretch unnaturally, darker and deeper than they should have been. And then I saw it, movement. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. A ripple beneath one of the body bags near the far wall. Then another. And another. "Oh no," I whispered, taking a step back, the tray in my hands trembling. "Oh God, no." The scraping sound came again, louder this time. I turned my head sharply to see that Mr. Halverson had moved again, his torso lifting slightly off the table as if he were trying to sit up. His neck craned toward me, that unnatural smile still plastered on his face. The sound of his bones creaking with the effort made my stomach churn. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I did, I caught more movement from the corner of my eye. One of the other body bags shifted, the vinyl rippling as though something inside it was writhing, struggling to get out. Then another, and another. "Stop," I said, more to myself than to whatever was happening. "Just stop. This isn't real. It's not real." But it didn't stop. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, as more of the bags began to stir. The sound of zippers being tugged, slow, deliberate, joined the chorus. One by one, the black vinyl bags began to open, exposing pale, lifeless limbs that twitched and stretched like they were waking from a long sleep. I was hyperventilating now, backing toward the door. My hand fumbled for the handle, slick with sweat. My vision blurred, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. All I could think was that I had to get out. I had to get out before the lights went out. The room plunged into pitch blackness, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own labored breathing. The fluorescent lights above me had gone completely silent. No hum, no flicker, just a suffocating void. I pressed my back against the door, my fingers scrabbling for the handle, but I couldn't seem to find it in the dark. Then the sounds began. It started as a faint shuffling, like feet dragging against the tiled floor. Slow, deliberate, growing louder with every second. My breath caught in my throat as a metallic clink echoed. A tray falling off a counter, maybe. Something brushed against one of the gurneys, the wheels squeaking faintly. I clung to the metal tray I'd picked up earlier, holding it in front of me like a shield, even though it felt pathetically useless. "Hello," I croaked into the dark, my voice trembling. No answer, but the shuffling continued, closer now. I swore I could hear it coming from multiple directions, like the entire room was stirring. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I closed my eyes, though it made no difference in the blackness, and forced myself to listen. The faint rustle of vinyl against metal sent a chill racing down my spine. The body bags, they were still moving, slowly, methodically, as if the dead were testing their limits. My mind reeled, grasping for explanations. Maybe it was some kind of gas trapped in the bodies, or a prank, or anything that wasn't what it felt like. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't normal. This wasn't science. Something was in the room with me. The shuffling sound was closer now, maybe just a few feet away. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. A whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling and creaking, but it was there. A voice, low and guttural, words slurred together like someone trying to speak through a mouth full of water, said my name. "Paul?" It hissed, dragging the word out into a grotesque, wet drawl. "Paul." I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as terror overtook me. My knees felt weak, and I clung to the edge of the counter to keep myself upright. The room felt alive, pulsing with the sound of movement. Zippers sliding open, bodies shifting, bones creaking as they twisted into unnatural angles. And then, somewhere to my right, I heard a thud, something heavy hitting the floor. My stomach clenched as I realized what it was. One of the bodies had fallen off its gurney, or climbed off. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move, my hand finally finding the cold, smooth surface of the door handle. I twisted it frantically, yanking at the door, but it didn't budge. It was locked. Panic set in as I pulled harder, slamming my shoulder into the door, my tray clattering to the floor. "Come on!" I shouted, the sound breaking the eerie stillness. "Open, damn it!" Behind me, the whispering grew louder. My name again, repeated over and over, sometimes in voices I didn't recognize, sometimes in voices I did. My mother's voice, my brother's, voices of people who were dead, their tones distorted and warped into something cruel and mocking. Pa-ow! I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around, pressing my back against the door, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. For a moment, everything was quiet again, like the room was holding its breath. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, barely visible in the faint glow from the emergency exit sign. A figure standing unnaturally still in the center of the room. It was tall and thin, its limbs slightly too long, its head cocked to the side like it was studying me. I couldn't make out its face, if it even had one, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and oppressive, boring into me. The shuffling started again, louder this time, as more shapes emerged from the shadows. Figures crawling out of body bags, dragging themselves off tables, their movements jerky and inhuman. The sound of bare feet slapping against the tile filled the room as they closed in, their heads tilting at odd angles, their mouths hanging open in silent, gaping expressions. Pa-owl! The voices hissed, overlapping now, a cacophony of whispers that grew louder and louder until it felt like they were inside my skull. I pressed myself harder against the door, my hands scrabbling for anything that could help. And then I remembered the key, my badge. It had a magnetic strip that unlocked the door. I frantically reached for it, fingers shaking as I swiped it through the reader. The lock clicked. I didn't think. I didn't wait. I yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. My back hit the wall, and I slid to the floor, gasping for breath. The fluorescent lights in the hallway were blinding after the darkness of the morgue, but I didn't care. I was out. I was safe, or so I thought, because even as I sat there, trembling and clutching my knees to my chest, I could still hear it, faint, muffled through the thick steel door. Pa-owl! I sat in that hallway for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. My breath came in shallow gasps, and every inch of me was slick with sweat, but the sound of my name, soft, distorted, and wrong, kept echoing in my ears. I stared at the steel morgue door, half expecting it to burst open, but it didn't. It just sat there, heavy and unyielding, the little keypad glowing faintly red. The whispers had stopped now, but somehow that made it worse. The silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like a trap. I needed to leave, to get out of the hospital entirely. My hands trembled as I pushed myself to my feet, leaning heavily against the wall for support. The hallway stretched ahead of me, empty and brightly lit, but even in its sterile stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My legs felt weak, like they'd give out at any second, but I forced myself to move. The hospital was mostly deserted at this hour. Night shift skeleton crew. I could hear the faint hum of machinery from somewhere down the hall, the occasional click of a distant keyboard, the sounds of normalcy of people going about their jobs. I clung to them, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But as I made my way toward the exit, I started to notice things. At first, it was subtle. The lights above me flickered as I passed under them, a soft buzzing sound accompanying each stutter. I told myself it was nothing, just old wiring, nothing unusual. But then I passed an empty nurse's station, and the computer monitor sitting on the desk flickered to life. A blank screen, just black with a small, blinking cursor in the corner. Typed a single word, Paul. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, my heart lurching into my throat. My mind scrambled for an explanation. A glitch? A prank? Some kind of cruel coincidence? I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as my paranoia running wild, but I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen in the morgue. As I turned to hurry away, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A reflection, faint but unmistakable, in the dark screen of the monitor. Something behind me. I whipped around, my breath hitching. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different now. Heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. I forced myself to keep moving, practically running toward the elevator at the end of the hall. My footsteps echoed off the walls, louder than they should have been, like the sound was bouncing back at me from just inches away. When I reached the elevator, I jabbed the button repeatedly, my fingers slamming into it with increasing desperation. The light above the door flickered on, and I heard the distant hum of the cab moving. It felt like an eternity before the doors finally slid open, revealing the empty interior. I stepped inside and hit the ground floor button, leaning against the back wall as the doors closed. The ride down was agonizingly slow. The elevator rattled and groaned, and I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the reflective surface of the doors. My pale, sweat-soaked face stared back at me, wide-eyed and trembling. But as the elevator descended, I started to notice something else. The reflection behind me. It was faint at first, just a shadow that didn't seem to belong. But as I stared, it became clearer. A figure, tall and thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch just a little too far, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I spun around, pressing myself against the wall, but the elevator was empty. Just me and the flickering lights. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned back to the doors, my eyes locking onto the reflection once more. The figure was closer now. It was standing right behind me, its head so close that it seemed like I should feel its breath on my neck. But there was no warmth, no sound, just that awful, oppressive stillness. Its face was blurry, distorted like an out-of-focus photograph, but its eyes, God, its eyes were clear, pale and glassy, identical to Mr. Halverson's. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open to the lobby, and I bolted out without a second thought. My footsteps echoed across the polished floor as I made a beeline for the exit. I didn't look back, didn't dare check if I was alone. I just kept moving, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the morgue as possible. When I finally stumbled outside, the cold night air hit me like a punch to the chest. I doubled over, gasping, the world spinning around me. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty, the few scattered cars illuminated by flickering streetlights. I fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling so badly that I almost dropped them. As I climbed into my car and locked the doors, I allowed myself a single moment of relief. I was out. I was safe. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to calm my racing heart. But as I looked up at the hospital, something caught my eye. In one of the third-floor windows, just above where the morgue was housed, I saw a figure. It was standing perfectly still, its head tilted at that familiar unnatural angle. Even from this distance, I could feel its gaze. It raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. The whisper came again, so faint I wasn't sure if it was real or just in my head. Pa Al. I didn't go home right away. Couldn't. My hands were still shaking too much to properly grip the wheel, and my brain felt like it was tearing itself apart, stuck in a loop of disbelief and terror. Instead, I drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring as I tried to make sense of what had happened. What was that? Some kind of hallucination? Stress-induced breakdown? It had to be. Bodies didn't just move, whisper, and crawl out of morgue drawers. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't shake the memory of those pale, glassy eyes or the whispers of my name. My mind replayed them over and over, each time more vivid than the last. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner, the kind that looks like it hasn't updated its menu or decor since the 70s. The fluorescent sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow across the cracked asphalt. I sat there in the car, engine idling, trying to convince myself to go inside. People would be there. Normal people. I just needed to be around someone, anyone who wasn't dead. But as I reached for the door handle, something stopped me. A feeling, that heavy, oppressive sensation I'd felt in the morgue. Like the air itself was watching me. My stomach twisted, and I slowly turned to look out the passenger side window. First, I didn't see anything. Just the empty parking lot stretching out into the shadows. But then, in the farthest corner, I saw movement. A figure. It was standing just outside the circle of light from the diner's neon sign, half shrouded in darkness. My breath hitched as I realized it was the same figure I'd seen in the morgue, and the elevator, and the hospital window. Tall, thin, limbs too long, head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't move. It just stood there, its form barely visible in the dim light. But I felt it staring at me, its eyes boring into me even from across the lot. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out along my spine. I blinked, hoping it would vanish. But when I opened my eyes, it was still there. Closer now. I hadn't seen it move, but it was definitely closer, just at the edge of the light. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I wanted to start the car to get the hell out of there, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the thing in front of me. And then it smiled. The edges of its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, too wide, like its skin was tearing to make room. Its teeth were impossibly white and perfectly even, but they didn't look human. They were too sharp, too predatory. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at me, its hand twisted and claw-like, the fingers crooked at unnatural angles. The whisper came again, faint but clear, carried on the wind that rattled through the parking lot. Pa-ow! That was enough to snap me out of my stupor. I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as I whipped out of the parking space. My heart pounded in my chest as I sped down the empty streets, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see the thing chasing me. But it didn't. At least not that I could see. The road behind me was dark and empty, but the sense of being watched never left. It clung to me, heavy and suffocating, no matter how far I drove. I didn't stop again until I reached my apartment building. My fingers fumbled with the keys as I unlocked the door, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind me. I bolted the lock and leaned against the door, gasping for breath. For the first time in hours, I felt relatively safe. My apartment was small but familiar, a comforting cocoon of normalcy. I checked every window, every door, making sure they were locked tight. Then I turned on every light in the place, flooding the rooms with warm, artificial brightness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the shadows at bay. Or so I thought. It was nearly 4 a.m. by the time I finally sat down on the couch, too exhausted to think straight. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I grabbed it instinctively, grateful for the distraction. But when I saw the screen, my blood ran cold. It was a notification from the hospital's security system. Motion detected in the morgue. I stared at the words, my heart hammering in my chest. The alert shouldn't have been sent to me. I wasn't security, and my shift had ended hours ago. But there it was, glaring at me like a cruel joke. My hand shook as I tapped the notification, pulling up the live camera feed. First, everything looked normal. The morgue was still and empty, the rows of gurneys and body bags exactly as I'd left them. The fluorescents buzzed faintly, casting their harsh light across the sterile room. But then I saw it. One of the body bags in the corner twitched. And then another, and another. The feed glitched, the screen flickering with static, but not before I caught a glimpse of the gurneys. They were all empty, every single one. The camera panned, the motion sensors tracking something I couldn't see. The view shifted toward the morgue door, toward the camera itself, and my stomach dropped. A figure stood there, staring directly into the lens. The feed cut to black. And then, from somewhere deep within the silence of my apartment, I heard the whisper again. Pa-ow. The whisper came from my bedroom. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The air was suffocatingly still, heavy with the kind of silence that feels alive. Slowly, I turned toward the hallway that led to my bedroom door. The light was on. I'd made sure of that, but the shadows just beyond the doorway seemed darker, like they were pooling, shifting. Pa Owl. The voice was closer now, low and guttural, dripping with mockery. It didn't feel like it was calling me. Felt like it was inside me. My knees buckled, and I clung to the armrest of the couch, willing myself to breathe. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911, but the call didn't go through. No ring, no dial tone, just silence. And then, from the phone speaker, came the whisper. Pa Owl, let us in. I dropped the phone like it had burned me and staggered toward the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, desperate to undo it, to escape. But before I could turn the knob, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I turned. It stood at the end of the hallway, half in shadow, its head tilted to the side. Its limbs were even longer than I remembered, the fingers dragging along the wall as it moved. Its smile had stretched wider now, impossibly wide, splitting its face into something grotesque. Stay, it whispered, taking a step closer. I lunged for the door. I wrenched the door open, throwing myself into the hallway of my apartment building. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, casting everything in sickly pulses of light and shadow. I slammed the door shut behind me and ran. The walls felt like they were closing in as I stumbled toward the stairwell. My ears were ringing, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I could still hear it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It was following me. I burst into the stairwell and started down, nearly tripping on the steps in my blind panic. My hand skidded along the cold metal railing as I descended, faster and faster. The sound of my shoes slamming against the concrete echoing around me. The footsteps behind me never changed pace. They didn't rush. They didn't falter. They just followed, steady and relentless. Pa Owl. The voice was clearer now, no longer a whisper. It echoed through the stairwell, bouncing off the walls and twisting into something that sounded less like a name and more like a taunt. I reached the ground floor and shoved the door open, stumbling into the building's lobby. The night clerk's desk was empty, the room eerily silent except for the faint hum of the vending machine in the corner. My pulse pounded in my ears as I sprinted toward the front door, slamming into it with both hands. Locked. No, no, no. I muttered, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My breath fogged up the glass as I looked out into the night. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. But then I saw it. The same figure standing under a flickering light, watching me, waiting. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. I turned my head slowly, every muscle in my body screaming not to. It was standing in the middle of the lobby, its head tilted to that unnatural angle, its arms stretched wide as if to welcome me. The smile on its face was grotesque, splitting its skin so far that I could see pale gums and rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Why run? It whispered, its voice low and mocking. You're one of us now. Before I could process its words, the lights in the lobby flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. I backed up against the door, my hands scrabbling for the lock, but I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything, except for the voice. And it was right next to me. Welcome home, Paul.